Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to show you how I made these amazing epoxy resin shelves. So for some great tips and tricks on how to get great results like these, stick around. Before we begin, let's take a quick look at the materials that we're going to use. So here we've got the wood that we're going to use for the shelves. This is lime wood. One of the characteristics of lime wood is it's got a lovely clean grain, nice and tight, and a very clean live edge. For the brackets, we're going to use these. These I bought from eBay. They're a simple right-angled bracket with a support, gives a nice rustic look to the shelf. We want to take a quick measurement to see how wide they are. So the depth on those is 9 inches. We want to make sure that the total depth of the shelf comes to no more than 9 inches so that it can sit inside this lip here. Before we get started, we just want to make sure that the timber's free of any defects that we don't want to keep in the final piece. Looking at the tops of these, you can see that there's quite a nasty crack running along the back of the wood. However, that doesn't really matter because, like I said, we're going to make this piece 7 inches in width, and the 7-inch mark comes to about there, so that's fine. On the second piece, we've got this knot in the middle here. I have actually worked to try and hog out some of the dead material. I'll probably fill that in with resin in order to give it a bit of structural integrity and to give it a little bit of an aesthetic feature. And again, there's nothing really on the back that we're worried about losing. So flipping the boards over, I mean, it doesn't really matter because these are going to be underneath. Again, there's the same thing, there's a bit of a knot, and you can actually see there's quite a lot of damage in that corner. But again, because we're going to make this 7 inches, it just about takes it off, so I think we're fine there. Flip the other board over. Another quick look. Again, you can see a few knots, but nothing really to speak of. So with that in mind, we're good to put them through the saw. If you haven't seen one of these before, this is a jointing jig. The idea being, it's made out of 18mm plywood with some T-track and some hold-down clamps built into it. This edge is totally straight, so this rides along the fence on the inside, and then that mirrors that parallel edge along the outside. So we'll run this through the saw, and we'll get a nice clean edge at the end of it. As you can see, we've got a lovely clean edge on this piece of wood now. So what we'll do, we'll quickly put the other piece through and we'll catch you back in a second. I've got the mounting saw set up here. We're going to quickly square off one edge. We'll measure up to 24 inches or just over 24 inches to give a bit of wiggle room. And then we'll make sure that they're both the same size. Great, now we've got two shelves exactly the same width. So what I've got here is some offcuts of plywood that we're going to use for the sides from a previous project. They're all well in excess of the size that we need, which makes things a little bit easier. However, if you don't have some already, then just some plain plywood or even MDF, as long as it's taped, as you can see here, you're fine. In terms of the bases, I don't have a piece of plywood big enough in order to make one base for both shelves. So what I've got here are some old offcuts of plywood. They're, again, well in excess of the size that we need, making them perfect for the application. We'll not bother cutting them down because the more area that we've got, the better. We'll focus on cutting the sides of the form to the right sizes and get the form built, and we'll show you that next. Awesome, now we've got all the sides for our form. Next step is we'll get these all taped up and I'll show you how we put the form together. Now we've got all the pieces ready for the form, so that's 4 end pieces and 4 side pieces. I'm going to show you how to make this base. Now this is my #1 top tip when making forms for any kind of epoxy resin work. So let's grab the base. So you saw this earlier. Now when you're building, especially a large piece of epoxy work, getting the piece off the mould can be a nightmare. I've seen people use polypropylene sheets, which is great, however they are expensive. I'm not going to argue that plywood is particularly cheap either, but this is just useful because I happen to have some pieces left over. So what I do is I grab some carpet protector tape. Now this stuff, really cheap to buy, you get loads of it on the roll. It's super easy to apply, you don't need to worry about the wrinkles because when we flatten the piece we're going to be taking those out of the resin anyway. When you're doing this, try and pull the sheet as tight as you can, and that minimises the wrinkles that go into the sheet. And the beauty with this, of course, is you can wrap the overlap around the sides, giving you a nice sealed piece of plywood. And there you have it, one base ready to go. The important thing is to get the shape roughly how you want it, because when we're finished, we're going to be running this through the table saw and the planer in order to get the right dimensions that we want. Okay, now we've got the finished mould, we've got the piece inside, we know it fits, we know it's a good size. The next step is we've got to seal it. What we're going to do is just use some normal silicone. I've chosen black. Reason for black is dead simple, it's easy to see. Some people use clear, that's fine, but I find it hard to see where exactly it is in the mould. So we'll run this around the inside, so around the bottom and up the sides, and that's enough to make it watertight. Cool, right, now that that's sealed up, again, with a top little tip, these are smoothing tools, and what these do is it gives you a nice round profile edge. Some people use their thumbs, that's fine. Personally, I can't stand it. Whoops. Fail. Now, onto everyone's favourite bit, the resin. What we've got here is a selection of pigment powders from Black Diamond Pigments. And I've been using their stuff now for about 12 months, and I'm so impressed. The colours that they produce are incredible. I've used them on a few pours now, and I'm just completely nutty over the moon with how they tend to come out. I'll make sure I put a link to them down in the description. In terms of what I want to choose for the actual pour itself, I'm thinking, because of the industrial nature of the bracket, something kind of a little bit steampunky. So what I'm seeing here, we've got this mahogany powder there, that's a kind of a nice dark colour. And what I might do then is put some copper in order to kind of get that swirl, so you'll kind of get that nice contrast without it being sort of too dark. So yeah, so with that we'll get onto the resin. Now the resin that I use is this, it's called Glasscast 50. It's made by a company in the UK called Easy Composites. I've been using it now for about 18 months and it's the only resin that I'll use. It's absolutely fantastic. It's 2 parts, so it's mixed in a ratio of 2:1 by volume, or I think it's 100:45 by weight. A lot of people seem to go by volume. That's how I've always done it. I've never found it to be any issues. I've never had a bad pour. What we'll do is we'll get it poured, we'll get it mixed, and then we'll get it into the form. Off camera I've gone ahead and got the forms now ready for the resin. What you can see is we've got cauls over the top of the wood in order to stop it from floating in the resin. I've gone ahead and cleaned out all of the excess silicone from inside the moulds. The cauls themselves have got tape around the base in order to stop the wood from sticking to the resin. And as you can see here, what I've done is I've gone and put a ring of silicone just around the notch that we want to fill. The idea being is that I can pull the resin now in that spot and it'll soak in and give a really nice clean finish. Before we get to the resin, I'm just going to talk you through the tools that we're going to use today for the pour. So first off, we've got a stir stick. This is just an offcut of plywood that I've used a few times. You can see where the resin has left a sheen on the wood. That seals it in and stops any dust from getting into the mix. We've got some lollipop sticks. This is to get the pigment powders out of the bags into the mix. We've got the powders themselves. Like I said before, we're going to go with mahogany and copper, a lovely kind of two-tone contrast effect. Kitchen roll for the cleanup. Essential when we're done with the stirring, we're going to use the kitchen roll to clean the stick off, and then we've got the jugs themselves. These are 2 5-litre jugs. I've done the calculation ahead of time already and worked out that we need 2.4 litres of resin, so these are plenty big enough for that. The reason for 2 jugs is that we're going to pour the mixture in one, we're going to mix it together, then we're going to pour it into the other, and this stops any unmixed resin from getting into the pour and causing problems later on. So now we've got the tools together, let's get to it. For this pour, we're going to go for a 2:1 by volume mix. So for 2.4 litres in total, we need 1.6 litres of resin and 0.8 litres of hardener. Now that we've got the resin in the container, it's important that we mix this for a good few minutes in order to make sure that all the ingredients are combined. So this makes sure then that there's not going to be any issues with the pour later on. So what we're going to do, now that we're mixing this together, we're going to get the first batch blended together, and then we're going to pour it into the second jug, and it's at that point that we're going to add the pigment then, so then there's nothing left over in this container. Whatever you do, resist the urge to scrape the sides as you're pouring it out, because that's the guaranteed way to add non-combined ingredients into the mix. While we're stirring it in this container, however, it is encouraged to make sure that you get it off the bottom, off the sides, and we're going to do this for a good few minutes. Okay, now that's nicely combined. We've been mixing that for a good few minutes. We can see that there's some air bubbles in there, but as I've said before, that's not a big deal. So what we're going to do now is we're going to decant it into our second jug, and then we're going to add the pigment. When it comes to adding pigment, I don't generally tend to go by weight, I tend to go by what looks right. Don't be tempted to overdo it. So we'll put that in. You can always add more, much harder to take it out. You need to make sure that when you're mixing this, you mix it absolutely thoroughly, because it's very easy to get little lumps of unmixed pigment which end up being a bit of an unsightly mess when you go ahead and pour it. So I'm going to go ahead and mix this now for another few minutes, and we'll get it poured into the form. I don't know if you can see, but the bubbles are slowly rising to the top. That's a good thing, we want that to happen, so that's the liquid degassing naturally. What we'll do when the mixture goes into the moulds is we'll pop those using a blowtorch. You can use a heat gun. I tend to find a blowtorch is quite effective and it gets it done quicker. Be careful, obviously we don't want to put too much heat into the resin, because that can cause it to go exothermic and ultimately fail. Just before you start pouring, make sure that your moulds are nice and level. I've made sure that these are leveled off using a spirit level. Now that you've done that, let's pour the resin in. It's at this point you want to go around and make sure that there's no leaks anywhere. If there is, just grab the silicone, quickly run it over, and you should be fine. So that's it for part one. Stay tuned for part two, where we'll be breaking these out of the moulds and running through the finishing process. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe, and comment below if you've got any questions. Until then, we'll see you next time. Right, let's go this time. Now we're going to get... Tell you what, your arms get tired after a while. Now we're going to cut the piece. Now we're going to get the... Why is it so hard to say? Okay, so here we've got all this... God. Try not to choke to death.